What's up, YouTube? It has been a while. I apologize for that, but I have some great stuff coming your way. Right now, I am going through the Torah, or what's known as the Pentateuch. This is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Also what's known as the law. And what I wanted to do is, I've been extensively combing the last 2 months through the entire law. As Jesus says, the law and the prophets testify to me. In the Old Testament law that we need to understand, and there's also some of that law, moral law, which carries over into the New Testament, but not as a way of the Christian justifying himself before God, but serving functions in the Christian life. What I'd like to do is kind of break down an overview of these 5 books, the Torah, or the Pentateuch as it's known, the teaching of the law, or also known as Moses. When Moses is referred to in the New Testament, this is the reference to Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible where God lays out the law. Now, we're going to get into Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Genesis and Exodus and all of these things, but it's going to take several videos. So we'll probably do kind of a playlist on this, but this is the first video, an overview of what's going on with the law, its functions, and most importantly, Jesus. Give us Jesus, right? So thank you, Lutheran or person who just stumbled across us, for tuning in, and stick with us. Let's break into this and start going through what's going on here. In Genesis, we have the creation account and we have the fall into sin. Then we have the first promise of Jesus in Genesis 3. Then we go through several things like the flood and God wiping out sin, saving the righteous, 8 souls in all are saved on the ark. And then we come to Abraham, we come to Isaac, Jacob from there, and Jacob is later known as Israel. Okay, and then Israel is eventually caught up into Egypt, where they are servants to the Egyptians, and they are there over 400 years. God hears their cry, and he rescues them, and he sends Moses to do this, but God performs the 10 plagues on Egypt, right, to get Pharaoh to let the people go. Eventually, Israel leaves, right, and the Egyptians follow, and God drowns them in the Red Sea as the children of Israel baptize into Moses. That is the Exodus. And then the children wander through the desert 40 years because of their faithlessness. Let's not forget that. I mean, literally, Egypt and the Promised Land are right next to each other, but the children do circles in the desert because of their faithlessness to God. Well, he's performing the miraculous amongst them, which is just shocking. The things we want to pay attention to so far in this for Jesus are the angel of the Lord. And let's not use the postmodern Western way of thinking of angel, because in Hebrew, angel means messenger. So this messenger is called Yahweh Elohim, the one who appears to Moses in the burning bush. This is Jesus, the one who appears to Abraham. We want to pay attention to the cloud of smoke by day and the pillar of fire by night. This was God in the smoke and the fire leading the people, his people, who he called forth out of bondage of Egypt to free them. Now, this is typological from Christ freeing us from sin, death, and the devil, but these things really happened in the Old Testament, and they're important to talk about. Then we get to the unfaithfulness of the people, and then God saying, hey, you're not going to enter the Promised Land because of your unfaithfulness, right? And then we get to the next generation. Then we get to Leviticus, okay? And Leviticus is all about clean and unclean, holy and unholy. It's all about how a sinful person can approach a holy and righteous and perfect God. Okay, because those two really don't combine, do they? Remember, Christ is promised, but he has not yet fulfilled the law and the prophets on our behalf. After, we're going to get to Leviticus 2. We're going to break this up into sections, And after they go through Leviticus and the whole Levitical code, which we'll talk about holy and unholy, clean and unclean, and the significance and some of the things in there that are sacramental and point us forward in the New Testament. Then we get to the book of Numbers. The children of Israel are numbered, the tribes are established. And in the book of Numbers, the people are given more laws and rules and regulations. And then we get to Deuteronomy, where God calls all that he had done before. It reminds us of all the laws. Again, each book, God is very repetitive on the laws through each book for a reason. We're not supposed to forget them. And when we get to Deuteronomy, God establishes more laws through Moses before the children of Israel cross over into the promised land. Now, there's a lot that I left out there, but we're going to do kind of a video series on this, and we'll eventually break everything down per book and why these things are important, why the laws exist and whatnot. So first, let's talk about the law overview in the Old Testament, just kind of how it relates. So there, between the 5 books, you have 3 laws. Okay, you have 1 law, you have 2 law, and you have 3 law. 3 different types of laws. You had the ceremonial law here. You had I should erase that, because first you have moral law, which is given to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai in the tablets of stone. And this was placed in the Ark of the Covenant. This has great significance. And the Christian today observes moral law, the 10 Commandments, not to be justified, but because there's still a function, okay? And then you have ceremonial law, which is God defines worship. God defines worship and how the people are to practice worship and conduct themselves, because the Old Testament is a theonomy, okay? It's God ruling over the people. He establishes order. He establishes not only the church, but the state. He even breaks it down to family matters. So you have the 3 estates that God governs directly with Israel. And then last, you have civil law. I guess I should put something else for ceremonial law, but you have moral law, ceremonial law, and you have civil law, okay? So there's 3 different types of laws in the Old Covenant. Now, we cross these off. We have governors and kings and other rulers of the world that rule civil law basically through natural law, through moral law here. And then ceremonial law, obviously, is gone because Christ is the fulfillment of that. But there's some overlap between moral law and ceremonial law that's important, and we will get into this into other videos. But I just wanted to break some of this down on what's going on. The problem is today in the church, the Old Testament is a closed book to most Christians, and it shouldn't be, because Jesus said, the law and the prophets testify to me. So as I'm going through the Old Testament, what is important, especially the law, when I'm combing through it, it's probably been 2 years since I've read the Old Testament straight through, but this time I'm going very slow and I'm combing through it to find Christ. Okay, one thing that's very significant that I noticed in the Old Testament, as God hands out these laws, okay, all the laws, that's 5 books of laws, chapter after chapter after, Deuteronomy alone is 34 chapters. These are big, big books. What's important to note is that not one time did the people say, hey, I can't do this. Where is the mercy? Where's the grace? I can't do this. And that's the point of the majority of the laws on the laws on the laws, to show you, hey, you need Jesus. Okay, he's the fulfillment of these laws. He's the one that takes God's wrath away. The covenant with Israel is this, that the people obey the commands of God, the entire system of laws, and then God will bless them. Okay? But we can't forget about the promised Messiah in that. Okay? Jesus comes from the promise of Genesis 3, and then again is mentioned throughout the books of the law. Not too much. This is law and not gospel. Now remember, we want to distinguish law and gospel, because we are not justified by the law. We're justified by the gospel over here, by Christ in his merits, because our merits with the law have failed and they're utterly worthless. Okay? I take that back. They're not utterly worthless. I'm sorry. They are good works when done from faith. The law does show us what to do. But when it comes to ceremonial law and that sort of stuff, Christ is the fulfillment of that. We have some freedom in the way we worship, but what we want to take away from the Old Testament is we're not free just to do whatever we want to do. God establishes order, and he wants us to follow that order. He's a God of order and not a God of chaos. That's one distinction I want to make. Not once did the Israelites, and as I'm going through this, I'm thinking to myself, man, I can't even fathom doing this. But these guys, I mean, they didn't even say, hey, where's this Messiah you promised? They said that they could do it. And that's terrifying. So if we look at Numbers, if we look at the book of Numbers, there was over 600,000 people numbered at Mount Sinai when Moses came down. That left, okay? Because when Moses came down, Aaron was making a golden calf, and then what happened? God incurred judgment on the people, and the Levites took the sword and they slaughtered 3,000 people for their wickedness. I'll get back to that in a second. When they had left the base camp, when they had went to march, there was over 600,000 people. Now, when they get to the promised land, only 2 people make it in. Mr. Wolfmuller, my 2 fingers that you say are 7 because they're so fat. So 2 for you. Anyways, sorry. Over 600,000 people are numbered when they leave Mount Sinai. Only 2 make it in, Caleb and Joshua. The rest were that faithless. Even Moses didn't make it. And God says to Moses, speak thou unto this rock and give the people water. Moses is fed up with the people and he say, should that I give you water? I'm tired of you people, basically. You're rebellious and a wicked people. But you see, that's not what God told him to say. And then Moses struck the rock. Now, Paul later tells us in the New Testament that rock was Christ. And Moses kind of expelled himself from the promised land. But the good thing to note is that he didn't expel himself from salvation. Okay, there's still always mercy with God. We see David cry out, but we'll get to that later when we're in the prophets. Going back to what I said about judgment with God, it is important to note because people see in the Old Testament, they see an angry God. Okay, the clouds and I don't know what kind of thunderbolt that is, but yeah. And then in the New Testament, they see a loving, merciful God. Okay, so they see an angry God with horrible thunder and plagues and all this stuff raining down, and curses and everything else. And in the New Testament, they just seem to say, oh, God is loving. You know, I have the cross here. Oh man, bad artist. I have the cross here. God's loving, Jesus, yada, yada, yada. But you guys got to remember, this Jesus is this God over here. And what you think here is not what you think. These two are equal, and what this is not an angry God. This is righteous and just judgment. That righteous and just judgment that ended up on the people was because of their own wickedness, and they said, hey, I can do these things, and they couldn't. But what God eventually does is he takes this anger, which is rightly so because it's against sin, and he puts it here on the cross. He puts it on Jesus, who willingly endures the cross for us. So the important thing to remember is that this is not 2 gods between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament does not belong to the synagogue, okay? The Old Testament belongs to the church, and that's why I'm carefully combing it through, and I want to pull out the best stuff for you guys so that you can learn from the law the things of Christ, what points to Christ, and the fulfillment, what Jesus has saved us from. I mean, the law is so heavy. Between the whole life of the Hebrew revolved around the worship of God in the Levitical codes, moral law, civil law. All this stuff was mapped out down to their clothes. And it's important to note that their whole life was this way. So the Christian life should not be a life of, hey, Jesus saved me, now I'll just do whatever I want. He's an insurance card. The Christian life should revolve around the church. It should revolve around Christ crucified, and we shouldn't take the freedom that we have in Christ and abuse it. Now, Paul says the same thing in the New Testament, right? Shall we abuse the grace of God? No. Or is the law bad? No. The law serves a function. For instance, when Moses came down from the mount with the 10 commandments in hand, let's take Aaron and all that out for a minute. God then says, assemble the congregation and I will give them the law. And God goes to speak the 10 commandments directly to the people. Here's the thing though, the people are terrified. And they say, Moses, you speak with us and let not God speak with us, for we will surely die. And you know what? They're right. Why? Because the law kills. Why? Because it's bad? No, because we're bad. It exposes the sin within us and we die because of that sin, because we're evil. But thanks be to God, he hasn't left us in this state. He has given us Christ crucified. Now, Leviticus and all of this is how to worship a holy God before Christ at the right time came down, how the people approached a holy God and their sin was covered. So we're going to go through that to see how this correlates directly to Christ. Anyways, the Old Testament should not be a lost book. There's a lot of things left out in there, I know, and I'm going to get back to it. We're going to do a series on this. I'm going to break things down a little bit more, and we'll go more in depth on each thing. I just wanted to do a quick overview and let you know, hey, Lutheran for the Lutheran is still here for you guys, and I'm sorry about the delay, but this teaching is very important, okay? It always goes back to Jesus. The law and the prophets testify to me. That's Jesus's simple sentence, and that's this much Bible then, right? That we have to go through and say, where does this point to Jesus? We can't, especially in this day and age, we can't have ignorant Christians. We have to have smart Christians who understand doctrine, logic, reason, and all of these, because our faith is challenged daily. Okay, the devil has really taken a hold of the world. Like Solomon says, nothing new under the sun, but we need to be ready for this. And we need to be ready to give a faithful witness of what we believe. Do this in short, use the creed. That's a faithful witness. But let's let iron sharpen iron. But let's go back and let's go through the history of the Old Testament and let's pull out Christ and show how Jesus relates and make these things understandable to each of us in the church, especially for the wise and the newly learned. We want to continue to learn and grow in our faith. So this is a quick overview of the law. We're going to get into a playlist of videos that really show what's happening in the Old Testament here in these first 5 books of the Bible. And then after that, we're going to start creeping into the prophets, which will be really cool. We'll do a whole series of scripture. Now, there might be a break in between because I have been in the law so long that I am extinguished by the law. The law shows sin, right? It curbs sin and it guides the sinner on what we should be doing. But that being said, just hearing law, maybe a sentence of gospel, I might need to take a break and do Ephesians or something like that for a while, just so that I can see the love and mercy of God, because the gospel message cannot be proclaimed enough. So both God's word of law and gospel, that's what we want. And we want to know, how does this fit into Jesus? And we know that both come from Jesus. Until next time, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Point your friends to this channel. We're going to be doing a whole lot. Grace, yo.